globalism has been one of these things, one of these topics that people have been talking about an awful lot in the last 20 years, 30 years or so. Basically, it really began to be talked about after the end of the Cold War. A lot of people initially discussing it very much as a kind of economic relationship. The fact that, countries would be able to trade with each other in an uninterrupted way. That was how, as I remember, it was initially presented, that we would have the global economy come together, become integrated in that fashion. And of course, that all sounded very innocuous. And in fact, it was so innocuous, it was basically banal, because the global economy has been integrated together since at least the mid-19th century, as any economic historian would know. So why was that different? Well, I think it gradually and clearly became obvious that what we were talking about was something very different. It wasn't just a trading system and an economic system. It was also a philosophical and political and ideological system that was beginning to develop. And it was one that was being very, very strongly advocated by a small group of very influential and very powerful people. And saying that, one has to be clear, they do come together, they do meet. We're not, however, talking about, a kind of James Bond Spectre type organization, if only because what they do and what they say, they do and say in clear view. They make no attempt, these people that we're talking about, to conceal in any way what they're about. Well, one person who has been keeping a close eye on all of this and has been talking about it for a very long time and has been, I think it's fair to say, critical of it. And critical of it, not just because it leads in all sorts of very bad directions, which I think it does, but also because it is fundamentally unsustainable. And its conception, the whole conception behind it, is one of control, which is unsustainable. One person who's been talking about it is Dyer. And Alex said that nobody, no guest have we been asked to invite more than Jay. And I'm sure this is partly why, because he can take us through and discuss this with us in a way that I think no one else can. So, Jay, what is globalism? Let's start with that. I don't mean, it's the international global economic system, which has existed since the mid-19th century. I mean the ideology, the plan. I think plan is not too far-fetched a word. The plan that we have seen develop over the last 30 years. And who is behind it? Two colossal questions, but we've only got a limited amount of time with you. So let's go straight in, and let's start with globalism itself. What is it?
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that there was this sort of selling point some decades ago after the Cold War that under the guise of economics, we might achieve this new peaceful order. And I want to go to a place that probably not many people would expect. And if you go back to the Enlightenment, there's a little known treatise that Immanuel Kant wrote that I think is very influential. And he wrote in that treatise that when we had full on laissez-faire, free trade, et cetera, when that was fully realized, we would have what he basically calls a new world order and a kind of global peace based around homo economicus, that man seen only as an economic unit. If viewed in that way and if understood in that way, if that's the case, which I think they just all sort of assumed at that time, David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all these characters, that really that would be the way that we would achieve this future order. They had a lot of opposition from what I believe was kind of their dialectical opposition as Western ideology progresses towards the rise of things like socialism after the Jacobins and the communists come about. And I think that the idea was that this dialectical conflict would produce this eventual peaceful order. So I think they had a lot of true believers on both sides of the conflict, whether they were dialectical materialists, historical materialists, or whether they were libertarian anarcho-capitalists or monopoly capitalists. All of those things coalesce. One of the key texts that, kind of two texts actually that form my approach to this question was the writings of Dr. Carroll Quigley, both his Tragedy and Hope and his book Anglo-American Establishment. I think they give kind of an inside view. I apologize for the coughing. The allergies are terrible here, but in both of those books, he really just lays out what you're talking about, this inside view from the perspective of entities like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, their view. Bilderberg Group could be another one of these big steering committees, the view of the think tanks and the NGOs and the power players in the Western Anglosphere, the Atlanticist power bloc, what they felt like would be the hope for the world. And I like that you pointed out it's much more than just an economic system, even though I think the original idea was that the philosophy of liberal economics, that would be the means, the mechanism. It ends up being much more than that. It ends up being an ideological commitment and ultimately even a kind of a technology, I think, to subvert and transform anything that opposes it. And I'll end with this point. And again, Dr. Quigley's books are not conspiracy texts. They're apologetics for this approach. He argues that the tragedy of the last century was the two world wars. The hope is the democratic capitalist liberal order that would be then preferred and promoted and sort of almost mandated, I guess you could say, on the entire world. And so is that really a solution? Is it really, the final stage of Fukuyama type stuff? I don't think so. I think it's unsustainable. And he says basically that the two enemies that would have to be combated by the Atlanticist establishment would be Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russia. These two would have to be taken out. It's a sort of continuation of the great game. And that's what it is. We're living out, I think, that world, that reality right now as we see this conflict through both Middle Eastern conflicts and the conflict in the Ukraine. They both kind of reflect the older British imperial strategy and structure going back to Mackinder and people like that. So that's what we're living through. It is that that's the hope according to the Atlanticist establishment. But ultimately, I think that's pretty deceptive. The hope is very much tied to Malthusian ideology. They cloak that in a lot of humanitarian NGO. It has this humanitarian cloak that's really pushing a lot of subversive ideas in all these other countries.
Indeed, and I like the word you used, mandatory. We mandated this change would be mandated, and of course you mentioned that this is all about democratic liberalism and all of this, but ultimately there's not going to be very much choice for people if this is ever imposed on us in this way. So of course democracy, at least as I understand it, we are Greeks. I'm born in Athens, where we like to think democracy was invented. That's a questionable view, by the way, but anyway, we like to think that democracy, in fact, inherently involves choice. And this system, ultimately, despite the fact that it's always promoted as being intended to spread democracy, to me, it looks very much like it's there to abolish choice. It's the system you have to have. You're not really permitted to argue for alternatives. And you're also told always that seeking the best economic outcome, which is a questionable concept in itself, what is the best economic outcome, the most efficient one, that is the objective that one should always follow. So the quest for narrow economic efficiency should be the objective. And, a system that ultimately abolishes choice is the goal. Now, have I got this wrong? And what I've just said about it?
No, I think it lines up perfectly with the idea of Homo economicus. Man is essentially an interchangeable economic unit. The locus of human action and purpose is the marketplace. This is a very, Enlightenment based idea. I think we're still sort of manifesting, I guess, the process of the Enlightenment in the West, and where the bad places it might actually take us as we work out kind of the logical consistencies or actually inconsistencies in a lot of the philosophies of the Enlightenment. That's my take on it. I think you're absolutely right that, the idea of, Athenian democracy is very different from what today's, think tank based technocracy is using democracy as a cloak for. For example, best example of this is Jacques Attali's book, Brief History of the Future. There's a whole chapter towards the end of the book where he says that the spearhead of today's democracy, that today's revolution, the people's revolution, he says, is transhumanism. And so there's this sort of ironic anti-human impetus, he's basically saying, to become post-human. That's really the tip of the spear of democracy, which is, again, it's very odd. But if it's not odd if you take to heart the point that you're making here, which is that you can be the desire to transcend the boundaries of being human and the limitations that we have actually ends up coming out the other side and becoming something that becomes anti-human. So we get antinatalism, we get the Malthusian ideas, we get this anti-human impetus that, again, is the essence of this philosophy, because man is seen as a reductionist economic unit. He doesn't have any transcendent value or anything to give him, so-called rights. If you think about Enlightenment philosophy of rights, well, if man is just a kind of a meat sack, there's not really a basis, philosophically speaking, to have rights other than the rights accorded via some sort of technocratic superstate. And again, I think that's the real danger, is that the ultimate goal, if you look at even a book as unsuspecting, like Miles Copeland's book, Game of Nations, where as a CIA consultant, he's essentially revitalizing and changing at least two governments. He talks about both Syria and Egypt in that book as a consultant to modernize those governments. And he says that, look, if you want to understand what all we're up to, it's not about this or that weapons transfer, this black op. He says you need to understand the big picture. And he says you need to go read people like James Burnham and the Managerial Society. He says you need to go read Bertrand Russell. You need to read the Council on Foreign Relations documents. There's a whole appendix at the back of that book where he says that's if you really want to understand what the CIA is up to, it's that kind of stuff. It's not, this or that black op. I think that perfectly encapsulates the attitude and the perspective of what you're talking about. With democracy has nothing to do with human rights, equality for women, or any of that stuff. It's a cloak.
I mean, what you said about transcending one's own humanity, it brings me back actually to a conversation I had with a very senior cleric, Orthodox priest. In fact, he was the Archbishop of the Greek Church in London, who I used to know quite well some years ago. And he said that if you aspire to go beyond your human limits, then of course you cease to be human. And that is an absolutely terrible thing. That is the worst conceivable thing that you can do to yourself. Now, he wasn't, by the way, talking about some of the topics we're talking about now, but of course it is very closely related what he was talking about. But he was actually talking about Hollywood and films, and the fact that there were so many characters in Hollywood films nowadays who are, well, they're called superheroes. They have extraordinary powers. And he felt that this was extremely disturbing and was something that was taking us on a completely wrong course, and was a very, very bad thing as an example to people. It was an interesting conversation, but what you just said now brought back to me that very conversation, because of course an Orthodox priest would tell you that choice is in fact an absolute central part of being human. Having the gift to choose is something that human beings absolutely have. Of course, how you exercise it is important, and but you nonetheless do have that choice. If you're denied that choice entirely, and if you are reduced to economic construct, and one that's at the same time you're denying your humanity. Well, I think he would have been very concerned about that. And I think it ties in, frankly, very well to the point that he was making about films.
Yeah, I think it was Bernays that said the ultimate weapon for propaganda, that the greatest weapon the world's ever seen was Hollywood. So, you know, I think I cited that, and I wrote 2 books on Hollywood, and I think that makes sense. We're getting our new meaning, our mythology from movies, maybe in the 20th century. Maybe it's going to change now that people are no longer really interested in movies and that art form as much. Maybe video games are the future. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's the myth maker of the 20th century that gave us meaning. And I don't think it's accidental that what became kind of the big blockbuster phenomenon for the last 10, 20 years was the Marvel / comic book universe world, because that's all premised on a very naturalistic evolutionary ethos where man will, through his own devices and techne, achieve a kind of transcendence like we're talking about. And it is ultimately, I think you're absolutely right, a denial of what it means to be human. I also think there's an unintentional, perhaps, subversion of the incarnation itself. I mean, in Orthodox theology, we have the idea that the second person of the Godhead became man and thus affirmed the goodness of human nature and of humanity and of that human nature's eternal existence via, the resurrection, the eschaton, and so forth. And so it's any attack on human nature ultimately ends up being also an attack on the incarnation as well, because man is a little Christophany, to use the Orthodox terminology, meaning he's a little image of Christ. He's a little image of the divine, and that's his purpose. That's his telos. That's what he's intended to kind of work towards becoming in Orthodox theology. And I think that you get with this transhumanist ideology a kind of replacement gospel. I think it's a kind of it's kind of a cult too. If you look at some of the Silicon Valley elites that go to Burning Man and participate in kind of the rituals that go on there, they actually kind of see it as a quasi cult religious movement. And they'll kind of reinterpret Christianity's message and ethos as, well, it really, Christianity was just kind of talking about eternal life through the secret Gnostic tech that we have or whatever. I think that's very Gnostic. You actually see this when you read some of the people from the transhumanist line of thought. When you read Kurzweil, or if you read Noah Yuval Harari, or even Klaus, they really do speak in quasi-religious tones. In fact, when I was reading Klaus's 2018 Fourth Industrial Revolution book, I didn't expect him to be speaking of the new world that we're going into needs, he says something to the effect of a new covenant, a new ethic, a new covenantal religious ethic, which, well, I thought this was a book about technology and economics. Why are we having this, religious speak here? Well, then we find out that we're, a lot of the WEF partners with, in elements of the Vatican. Pope Francis is on board with a lot of the WEF. So it makes sense to, I think, push this sort of what I view as a religious delusion along with the tech and the economic policies that they want, because it's a whole worldview. They want to instill an entire worldview, not just, as you said, an economic system, and not even really an ideology. I think the technocrats that have studied this for so many decades, they understand that man is fundamentally a religious being. He's not fundamentally motivated by abstract reasoning and concepts. Bertrand Russell in one of his books says something like, if you want to sell people on your ideology, don't do it with logic and facts. Do it with big brass bands and music and song. And, that's what you see a more effective means of indoctrination, Hollywood, pop music, rather than ideology.
Who are these people who are behind this thing? Let's get back to this, because why do they want it? Is it all about power? I mean, do they have a perspective about this that is completely cynical? Is it that they feel that this is a mechanism for control? Or do they actually genuinely believe that, this is something that is the future for humanity, and that, they're kind of missionaries leading us to this world? I have to say, somebody who's had to do a lot of legal work in my past, in my own past. I always tend to be fairly cynical about motivations of people who tend to talk in this way. The people who are promoting these things always seem to me to be the people who expect at the end of the day that they will be the beneficiaries and that they will exercise control. But who are they? What kind of people are we talking about? Are they scientists? Are they technocrats? Are they people who have connections with the financial world? Are they doctors, diplomats, lawyers, or are they a class unto themselves?
I would say all the above, both for motivations and ideas, and all the above in terms of people recruited into the super class, the managerial class. I think Rothkopf had a book about, the managerial class, the 6,000 people or so that run the world. I think the best examples are people like a Kissinger or Brzezinski. And when we go and we read their books, we see that they're not necessarily in every case religious. I think a lot of those people are, a-religious, irreligious, atheistic, pragmatic. For example, I didn't see any evidence that David Rockefeller had any particular religious commitments, but I don't think that necessarily excludes other members who are true believers. They might have a true belief in the possibility of technology being a kind of Promethean flame, to take us to some sort of transcendent level. But it's hard to know, like you said, whether they really believe it. I mean, I think Klaus and Noah Harari, for example, are intelligent people. So you would think they would be able to recognize kind of fundamental contradictions. But when they both will say things like, well, you don't possess free will or consciousness, that's an illusion. By the way, we will upload your consciousness to the cloud. I mean, to me, that's a contradiction. I mean, you would think you would notice that at a kind of a basic logical level, but I think in a lot of cases that cynical pitchman thing is coming forward. I think there's a lot of phony lemon car salesman, bad car salesman at work in this domain. But I think you do have some true believers. I think some of the Silicon Valley people really believe, mainly because they've done a lot of hallucinogens, and that kind of contributes to the quasi-Gnostic ideology that they have, whether they know it or not, that leads them to believe that they will. I mean, it's very popular, well known that, Silicon Valley kind of comes out of the 60s counterculture. You've got people in that sphere very open about their DMT, LSD use. So I think there's a very easy overlap there with being a true believer in the power of tech to raise us to some immortality or whatever. And I think there's an element, a contingent of those people who really believe in something dark and satanic. I think we've seen people like Michael Aquino, who had some degree of influence, and he seemed to take his Satanism seriously. I mean, he could have been putting up a front. I mean, certainly these people are very adept at deception. If they're high level, intelligence operatives or something like that, then obviously they're very, very, very skilled in the art of lying. So it's very possible that they were putting on in front. But I really do think there's also a kind of motivating force, whatever your particular bent is. If you're on board with the same basic ideas, they're not really concerned with the particularities of your proclivities. So I think, when you read Klaus, when you read Brzezinski, when you read Kissinger, when you read David Rockefeller, when you read these Western power block elites, they tend to have kind of the same basic. I said something years ago. I did a video where it was like the 10 commandments of the global elite, and it was like, these are the 10 basic things that you have to believe without question to kind of be in that club. Not that believing that makes you a part of that club. I think you got to be recruited out of Harvard, Yale, put into CEO positions and whatnot. So I think, it's not, like you said at the beginning, it's not a mystery who we're talking about. CFR has been around for a long time. Bilderberg's been around for a long time. All that stuff's it's semi-public, I guess is what we could say. Yeah. They created Trilateral Commission for Brzezinski to run. That was a Kissinger idea. So we've seen the passing of that old guard of those guys, but it looks like they really wanted to kind of hand it over to like tech elites and Silicon Valley people. That's who was more and more showing up at Bilderberg in the last 8 or 10 years. But but I don't know how. I don't think that it's going as well as they thought it would.
We'll come to that in a moment, but briefly, I'd be very interested to know what your 10 commandments are for these people have. But let's just that is a question, but it's also another question, which is, this looks like a very, very management technocratic elitist vision of the future. I think that's the thing that we need to say. It's people who believe that they can control everything. The other thing I wanted to say is, it may be logical in its own terms, but it doesn't seem to me very rational, which is, maybe I'm, making a distinction between the two. I actually do think that logic and reason are not by any means the same things. But to me, it looks, in fact, frankly, completely irrational, as well as bleak and ugly and lacking any kind of humanity about it at all, and deeply unappealing to the vast majority of humankind once they've properly understood it. But let's start with the 10 Commandments, and maybe you can just comment on those other points I've just made.
I made that video maybe 6 years ago, so I don't know if I remember every single one of the 10 that I listed, but I think at that time I'd read about 30 or 40 of the Western power block elite texts. And so I just kind of noticed, like, well, they all kind of seem to say the same thing about, we've got to they always say, well, you have to believe that we're in a giant crisis. There's a huge crisis. And the only solution to this crisis is a global governance. We can't have nation states or firewalls of limited power blocks. It's got to be international in terms of its structure. You've got to have an international economic order, which would then preclude any types of, and I'm not trying to be libertarian, but I have plenty of critiques of libertarian philosophy, but that you can't really have a system of free exchange. So they do want to, I think, ultimately eliminate that. They talk about a single currency. You can find this back in Lord Birkenhead, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, all of those old school, sort of British upper structure elite who had a huge role, I think, in planning a lot of what we're going into in their writings. You have to essentially have a commitment to scientism, to a sort of a Darwinian philosophy of some type. They seem to be committed to technocratic governance on the whole. I couldn't find any member of that super class that's written that doesn't believe in a technocratic governance. I don't remember what all the other. There was three or four more.
I think
that's the basic idea.
I think we get the general gist.
Yeah. I mean, a couple books that really lay this out, I think, that are very telling is, if you read something like Impact of Science on Society by Russell, which, is almost a century old now. And then if you, fast forward up until the, Cold War period with something like Tragedy and Hope, the most important chapter in Tragedy and Hope, I've argued for a long time, is the very middle chapter where he talks about technocratic managerial governance of the future. He says that what the Western power blocks plan is ultimately to basically have everybody in smart cities and giant supercomputers running the city. And so, he's very explicit there about he thinks that's where we're going. We can come up maybe a decade ahead of that. Brzezinski writes Between Two Ages, the technotronic era. And then we come up into, Fritjof Capra is writing about radical eco type of stuff. All society has to be reorganized around the principles of Gaia, of the feminine, patriarchy. All of that has to be undermined, has to be inverted. In his book, I think it's Turning Point. That's another example. So there's many of these. There's the Changing Images of Man, the Stanford research. It also sort of makes the same point about reorganizing everything on the basis of these new principles, reintroduction of paganism. This is where we get the New Age movement as a big part of this, foisted and fostered by the elite. By the way, it's not a grassroots type of movement. It's very much amenable to the Pentagon's long-term plans, I think. And so, then we come up to people like Klaus, and he's essentially saying the same thing that H.G. Wells was saying 100 years before. So I think that's the the basic plan here. I think people get caught up in, well, is it fully a Marxist plan? You know, the American right mistakenly thinks that it's, quote, Marxist. You get other people who think, no, it's the monopoly capitalist. I really think it's a fusion of a lot of these different systems into whatever will work in the long run.
Well, we were talking about logic. I mean, this seems to me to have the logic of the ant colony. I mean, essentially, and the other thing to say about it, and it's the immediate instant thing. I mean, it abolishes history. Obviously, that goes without saying, and it creates stagnation. I mean, it is the end of development, human development. Now, human beings are not like this. I mean, we're different from each other. We're not ants. We're different from each other. We are, function in completely different ways. Function isn't even the right word. We live in completely different ways, and we have. I mean, we, in spite of everything, we do have the power of choice, which is inherent to us as human beings. It's not something that can be taken from us.
Right.
So you said that this isn't working. Well, it clearly isn't, because of course it can't. But the attempt to impose it is doing immense damage.
Absolutely. I think the reason it does this damage is because it's fundamentally against our nature. You made this point about it's fundamental to humans to have choice. The patristic teaching is that free will is a component of human nature. And so you couldn't have human nature without removing free will. And so the idea that you could get rid of it really it demonstrates the presupposition of a different metaphysic, which of course the power structure does have a different metaphysic. They see humans as essentially a reductionist, materialistic phenomenon that's a product of the cosmos that can then be sort of steered in terms of evolution. And so, and this is actually pretty explicit as well. Jonas Salk has a book, Survival of the Wisest, where he talks in this way that he says that the scientific priest class has to really step in and sort of steer humanity in evolution. And that's going to require things like, really radical Malthusian ideologies. So the implementation of this, other examples could be things like Tavistock. Tavistock heavily pushes and was behind all of the, I'm going to use my famous code words here, the TRANZ, things that we've seen in the last 10 years, 20 years. They were very bold and open about spearheading that from a sociological perspective on purpose. And I think that it makes perfect sense when you think about, well, why would they push that so hard? Well, that's a very, it's very adjacent to the transhumanist agenda, because the idea that we can, transcend all the limitations, including biological limitations and so forth, that very easily transitions into, oh, yes, well, then I can also now become a cyborg. I can become something beyond the human. There's a really great book that inadvertently, I think, admits all of this as well. From a journalist perspective, if you read Annie Jacobson's book on the history of DARPA, I read that whole thing, lectured through it, and it blew me away, because the very last chapter was where I think she was interviewing or having discussions with some of the transhumanist minded technocrats at DARPA. And they were very explicit about their philosophy. So you might think they would be very nerdy and into tech stuff, but they were very explicit that their operating system was a very dogmatic, radical materialism. And so it's almost like they were at war against the idea that man possesses free will, or that man possesses consciousness or mind or a soul, because for them that would necessitate that there might be something else transcendent. So I think the war against the soul and consciousness ends up they almost kind of admitted at times that it's a war on the idea of God and the transcendent. So yeah, I think you have to, it kind of goes together, right? Like if you're going to undermine human nature, it kind of goes along with the idea that we have to stamp out. I think Bertrand Russell at some point uses this terminology of stamping out free will or something like that.
Indeed. I mean, we can't have humans in a system like this. So we have to find ways to persuade people not to be humans. Essentially,
Exactly.
that is the nature of this, which ultimately is impossible. Now, it is running into problems. Let's actually talk a bit about those problems. We have Russia, which is, of course, the country which actually there were quite a lot of people with not entirely dissimilar ideas, especially if you go back to some of the writings that were widespread in Russia in the 1920s, when there was quite a lot of debate at that time. But there were, a lot of ideas that were not entirely different from the ones that we are seeing now. And by the way, people who often in the West today are hailed as great artistic figures, which I'm prepared to say they were. In fact, they were in many ways. The constructivists, for example, were right at the vanguard of this kind of thing. Anyway, Russia eventually doesn't like it. It moves on. It's reverting to orthodoxy. It's now a major stumbling block, or so it seems to me, in front of this thing. Putin himself, who's its president, very connected, I think, to Russian feeling. He's opposed it. He's straightforwardly come out and said, we don't like this. Other countries are doing the same. I mean, China, not obviously an Orthodox Christian country, but with a tradition and philosophy of its own, rooted in Confucianism. They're also coming out opposing it. In India, too, they're not very keen on this, and it's not difficult to understand why. And we are seeing conflicts flare up in all parts of the world. We have a major conflict, of course, in Ukraine. It's interesting that you brought up the issue of paganism, because people may not be aware of the fact that there is an awful lot of it practiced at this particular point in time in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And from exactly the kind of people that you'd expect and who would be closest to the thinking behind all of this. But one senses that these things aren't going very well. And again, I'm glad you used the word scientism, because in reality, if you're talking about science, actual science, the kind of thing that people used to think of as science, this isn't like that at all.
No.
And in fact, we're seeing a regression and scientific stagnation beginning to take hold as well. And in fact, it's clear to me that science is in fact the place where it's happening more is in places other than the West, partly, I think, as a result of all of this. So what would you say about this? I mean, are we indeed seeing this whole thing run into problems? Because I should say, I don't think this has much traction outside the West at all. And the rest of the world looking at this, not just Russia, China, India, but pretty much everywhere, they're rejecting it.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, as well as kind of what you said at the beginning, that it's very difficult to push an ideology, even with all of this sort of packaging and veneer of the promise of becoming a Marvel superhero and transcending limitations. I think when you realize that what's actually being pushed is, destructive to children and having a family, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where people are saying, oh, wait a minute. Okay, this is crazy. This is way too far. We have enough sense to not allow this into our countries, because it's essentially a weapon that undermines and really only could be pushed by, I think, a sort of psychopathic, oligarchical type of elite. Not even a. We think of a corrupt, elite power structure or something like that, or somebody greedy or something. This is almost beyond that, to like just a sort of a. It's like O'Brien in 1984 with this just insatiable hatred for humanity is what seems to be motivating the ideology of Western technocracy, because it must push the darkest elements to further the goals, and people are now seeing that. So I think that the biggest mistake was when it just sort of, from the corporate sort of CEO top-down level, went wholesale into, Skittles / TRA and Z agenda. I think that everybody saw that, and it was like, well, wait a minute, first of all, this shows that we're not really in some sort of free market if every Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company has the same agenda that's pushed that has nothing really to do with economics directly. It seems to have a lot to do with an ideology. And so, yeah, that woke a lot of people up. That shows that it's inherently anti-human, ultimately anti-natalist. And you mentioned the Ukraine, the sort of the push for these resurgent pagan ideologies. Those also are very, I've been arguing this for a long time, they're very amenable to what the Western power structure wants to push, because it opens you up, I think, to a return to the worship of nature, to the worship of the natural cycle, which the people who go into paganism or neo-paganism, they may not intend this, but it makes you very amenable to accepting death as a good thing and a natural thing, and something that perhaps should be part of the oligarchical structure's plan. So now we're moving into the acceptance of something like euthanasia, et cetera. And we're starting to see that, in places like Canada. So we begin to see that it's sort of like a death cult, I guess is the best way to put it. And I don't think it's accidental that, Tiny Mustache Man and his followers, they had that same ideology of a kind of a death cult ideology in the background. And when you get into the history of the Ukraine, particularly World War II, you get into Gladio, you get into the Galen networks, Galen org, that has a connection to the Ukraine at that time. That's why there's that network there, I think, at least from my research. And I see paganism and neo-paganism ideology foisted there as part of that Western, as well as Protestantism, charismaticism, Eastern Catholicism. Those are also techniques and tools and strategies of the Western power structure. Fordham University, famous Jesuit CIA university, very closely connected to a lot of these entities in the Ukraine. That's not accidental. That's all by design.
How is it that we in the West have proved so vulnerable to all of this? Is it because of the crisis of faith that we have seen develop since the mid-20th century? Because there has been a crisis of faith across the West. Of that, it's indisputable. It's gone very far in Europe. It's reached the United States. Is that why? Because we've lost faith, our own faith? Is that the vacuum that's been opened that these ideas have been able to fill? Is it also, again, we come back to what you were talking about, neo-paganism? Is it, the temptations of hedonism, which do exist as well, and are connected to it, it seems to me? Is this why it's happened? Because there doesn't seem to be the resistance to this in the West that you might have expected. As I said, to the rest of the world, I can say this with some certainty because I get lots of people from the rest of the world contacting me, and I read a lot of what they say and what the articles that they write about. They're starting to see us in the West as very weird. This isn't something which I think people in the West fully understand, especially policymakers, by the way. So why are we letting this happen to us? I mean, one can come up with all kinds of power-related reasons and economic-related reasons, but, people have pushed back before when all sorts of things have been done to them. Why are we not doing that much more than we actually are?
Yeah, I think the problem of the West is a long-term spiritual problem. And that's probably a different diagnosis than most people would give. And probably the easiest, most accessible book on this, and I don't agree with everything that this author writes, but I think he really hit on something that few people notice, is Dr. Philip Sherrard has a really excellent little 100-page book called Church, Papacy, Schism. And he goes back to the time of the schism between the East and the West. And he really says essentially that this produces kind of two different Europes. The Europe of the first millennium that produces Byzantium is a very different idea and ethos than the Europe that we get after the schism in the West, with what, for all intents and purposes, we call the Franco-Latin Papal Church. And so I'm not trying to foist everything on the papacy. Obviously, life is more complex than that. But the religious sentiment of the West goes in a very different direction than the ethos of the Orthodox Church. And what you get there eventually manifests as a kind of a choice between, well, you're either going to be a Protestant or you're going to be a papist, a Roman Catholic. And this, if you go to the key disputes in Byzantium, where St. Gregory Palamas is arguing with a lot of the Western-minded thinkers and theologians, the Barlaamites, the Akandinos, Prochoros, he says, if you adopt this ideology, what will happen is this theological aberration will result in mass atheism. So very few people will go to St. Gregory Palamas to locate, I think, this prophetic prediction. You know, we're talking Byzantium in 14th century, of warning that the West, if it adopted this theological mistake, that it would lead to mass atheism. But that's exactly what happened. And so not too long after that, I mean, there's other really great books as well that detailed the spiritual ideological. There's a great book that came out recently by Cambridge text by Sinisioglu, where he talks about the ideological subversion within Byzantium itself actually influenced a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers, Spinoza, Kant, and then some of the radical Jacobin socialists were influenced by Plethon. And so he locates this atheistic move that is very similar to the critiques of St. Gregory Palamas as well, in this kind of tending towards atheism, which then manifests in a lot of these dialectical movements from the Enlightenment onward that we talked about earlier. So I think it's at root a spiritual problem that leads to theological mistakes, theological errors, that then leads to other ideological errors. So yeah, I think that's the real thing. And it sounds a little odd because we don't usually think of theology as having that kind of an effect. But I actually think at root, we're all religious beings. We do kind of operate that way, even if we don't, in our conscious mind, think of it that way.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that this actually has a huge role to play. And I think if we don't, if one of the great problems with the study of history in the West is that it doesn't give enough weight to this sort of thing. Anyway, we've spoken a lot, and I know there's questions. So I'm going to transfer to Alex here, and I want to first of all say thank you. We've covered a huge amount of ground. I would hope very much that we're able to do more programs in the future and explore some of these points that you've made in a lot more detail, because we can definitely do that, it seems to me, in ways that I think a lot of people would find very interesting. But this is where I'm going to finish now, and I want to say thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Alex, and he'll probably have some questions to put to you. Thank you very much, Joe.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexander.
Yes, we do have a lot of questions, and that was a fantastic discussion. Covered a lot of ground for sure. And let's see what everyone is asking Jay. Let's start with Ricardo Alfonso. Cruel fate. Why do you mock me? You finally have Jay Dyer on, and I won't be able to watch it. But can you guys ask Jay to talk about Gladio and Intel agencies? He's a great researcher. I'll have to watch later. From Ricardo.
Well, yeah, in brief, I've done a few talks that spend a few hours on Gladio. I've done a few of Lord Voldemort's fourth hour on Gladio. So you could probably find those for more information. But this is really just a Cold War operation that the members of the OSS and CIA cooked up to supposedly stave off a Soviet invasion of Europe. So if Stalin decided that supposedly that he would move into Europe, there would be these cells that were set up all throughout Europe. And as more information has come out about this over the years, it was first discovered in the 90s. There were some writers who were already sort of on the cusp of it, even in the 80s, people like David Yallop. But as this came out, you had people begin to actually write full-on examinations of it. Daniel Ganser wrote basically what's a PhD thesis on it. And it turns out this was a much more widespread operation of sort of training saboteurs, assassins, and so forth to be ready for these sorts of operations. And it looks like they might have even been doing a lot more than that in terms of actually doing black ops. I think we find things like the Bologna bombing and so forth having connections to Gladio. And if you read the Paul Williams text, this really gets into depth with the Vatican Bank being used as a sort of a funnel for black operations, drug money, weapons, trades, and so forth. So I would recommend either Ganser's book or Paul Williams' book. They both focus on different things. Williams' book focuses on the Vatican element, as well as organized crime, the mafia, the P2 Lodge in Italy, Licio Gelli, Michel Sindona, Kissinger. Williams' thesis is basically Kissinger was running all of that in Italy. And then you have the Ganser thesis focuses more on the different cells and what they were doing in all the different countries like Turkey. So yeah, this was a pretty vast, wild, crazy operation that was cooked up, I think, by Hellawell and Donovan and Angleton.
From F. Fitz, hopefully Jay will tell the audience about the CFR's plans as described by Carroll Quigley.
Yes, we did hit that earlier on in terms of, and if you're interested in a longer treatise, I did a whole eight section lecture through Tragedy and Hope, and then I did a two installment lecture through Anglo-American Establishment. I do have his book on civilizations, but I haven't read that yet.
John Roberts says, my perspective as a citizen of a nation is the globalists look like a club of the super rich who hire Ivy League graduates as their minions as they obsessively seek to increase their wealth and power.
I would concur. Yeah, I think if you look at, for example, the OSS and CIA oftentimes recruiting out of, for many years at least, Harvard and Yale and Princeton, British intelligence basically, recruiting out of Oxford and Eton and Cambridge. So yeah, that's what we mean by the sort of recruitment process. It's not limited to intelligence operatives. Obviously, it includes CEOs, bankers, and as you pointed out, doctors, scientists, mad scientists. So yeah, I think all of these elements are recruited into that superstructure for sure.
GI1416, question to all of you, to Jay and Alexander. Did you read, and if yes, what did you think of Burnham's The Machiavellians?
That I've not read.
I haven't read it, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Zarael says, Jay, they are very religious. They understand it more than one wants to admit, but their religion is Antichrist. Religion is a human creation, not faith.
Yeah, I think a segment of the power structure, the power elite definitely do have religious commitments that they take seriously, but I think many of them don't. So but they all kind of align with a similar, game plan. So you don't have to be religious, I don't think, to be a member of that power structure.
Wade asks, outside the most basic natural law, how does rational man have belief in any mythology, theology, i.e. the miracle problem?
Well, a lot of the debates that I do with atheists, we end up kind of in the domain of philosophy. And so, having an assumption or a commitment ahead of time to what's not possible, that's based on a metaphysic. And so what I would do in that discussion or debate is ask you for an account or justification for your metaphysics that underlie the assumption that something miraculous or supernatural isn't possible. And if you could tell me then what the grounding for that metaphysic is, then, which I don't think an atheist or a materialist can, I've not found one yet. But if you fail at that task, then I would say that the conclusion that there are no miracles would be unjustified. So that's the transcendental argument for God. That's the move we make in terms of that apologetic.
And JJHW says, Operation Gladio, there's a full 1992 documentary from the BBC. And I'll put that link in the chat. Sophisticated Caveman says, what is the proper way to integrate this Gnostic technocratic worldview with the rest of the world? I doubt it's possible to get rid of it entirely.
Well, I mean, I guess from a Christian perspective, there will always be competing systems and ideologies and heresies and heterodoxies. And so, yeah, they may not always ultimately be eliminated before the end or the eschaton, whenever that is. But I'm not sure why we wouldn't necessarily need to, quote, integrate it, or what that means. It sounds kind of a Jungian thing. I don't think we need to integrate, things that are anti-human or that undermine civilization.
Anas Belachahab says, I once read in an old Freemasonry manual that the light is death. That is what the Gnostic teaches us. The manual mentioned Mozart being a member of the French Lodge. So this is a very old thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Magic Flute, right? I mean, that's essentially a kind of a Masonic pageant. So yeah, that's definitely, I think, the case. But I think there's a lot of different ideas within Masonry as to what the light is and what this or that thing is. If you look at Morals and Dogma, it's really just a kind of a comparative religion text where he just sort of smashes all of the religions together and says that's what Freemasonry is. Freemasonry is the true supra religion or philosophy. He says at times it's not a religion, even though it kind of is. So I don't think necessarily that there's one ultimate Masonic secret. I see Freemasonry as more of a tool of the British Empire's era of control. It was kind of their spy network. There's mainline histories that have been written about Freemasonry operating as the kind of the spy network of the British Empire. I don't think it's as important and influential today as it used to be, but I do think ultimately it's kind of an esoteric. If you read Morals and Dogma, he kind of goes into positing that it's really Neoplatonism, or a form of Neoplatonism. It's very similar to what Pleathon talked about when I mentioned Pleathon earlier.
Jay Alexander, any opinion on UK elite groups like Chatham House?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the CFR, is essentially Pratt House is based on Chatham House in the UK. And so it's supposed to be the sort of the U.S. mirror of that. That's the means by which the British establishment really sort of put their foot back in the door, so to speak, of American influence, power, and control. I mean, they were already kind of there with Colonel Edwin Mandell House and Woodrow Wilson. But I think the erection of the OSS via a lot of these British intelligence operatives like William Stevenson and Noel Coward and even Ian Fleming, that's being done out of a lot of these, New York offices and Rockefeller Plaza, as well as Pratt House, which is the mirror to Chatham House.
I have nothing. I've absolutely nothing to add to that. I mean, this is very much the British establishment and how it works. If you see it close up, which of course I have, and exactly as Jay says, a lot of it has migrated across the Atlantic, or the pond, as we call it often in London. And it's amazing how it's taken root there, actually, given how profoundly different American culture is from British in so many ways. As it's another whole topic about the Anglicization of a part of the American elite that took place over the course of the 20th century, which is very strange and not what I think one would have expected at the beginning of the 20th century. But it's exactly that. A lot of these things that the Americans developed, a lot of these ideas that the Americans developed, originate from British discussions and thinking and structures that were developed from about 1890 onwards. And anyway, they've taken root in the US.
Matthew says, nothing will fire up human resistance more than the erosion of free will. So while it is scary that these globalist elites exist, there is significant hope that this will all come crashing down.
Yeah, it doesn't really have anything to offer other than, ultimately, get in your coon pod and live in the matrix. I mean, that's the sort of the end result of this. And I don't think ultimately that will be, like Alexander said, we may experience a lot of damage and destruction on the way to that, end game being pushed, but I don't think it'll be successful.
You have time for a couple of more questions, Jay?
Sure.
Okay, great. Slow Boy Whiteboard says, thanks for having Jay on. Sparky says, euthanasia is pushed in the U.S. as hospice care. Doctors now talk patients into dying in a hospice where they stay for a few days and quietly give an overdose of morphine rather than treatment. It's the primary reason the life expectancy's at least a couple of years lower nowadays.
That makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised. I heard somebody talking the other day. I didn't verify this, but they had said something like upwards of 10K people have already been sort of goaded into this in Canada, and that they really started with elderly homeless people. So again, I haven't verified that, but it wouldn't surprise me. It would seem to line up with this ideology.
Sophisticated Caveman says, what is your view on the Rosicrucians?
They had a lot of influence on the Enlightenment. Dame Frances Yates's book, Rosicrucian Enlightenment, is kind of a classic. It's a famous text on that. I've done some talks on that years ago. So I think that Rosicrucianism is, it's important ideologically in tracing the development of the Enlightenment, but I don't find it convincing, and I think it's kind of a silly ideology ultimately.
All right. And finally, from Sparky, a borderless world run by a central authority. Jay, what could go wrong?
I see this as one of the chief weaknesses in the libertarian position. For so many years, the libertarians have pushed open borders in their crusade against, statism. And now we're at this juncture where I see a lot of libertarians kind of thinking, oh, wait a minute, actually, if we have completely open borders, this might actually be a problem for the system and the welfare system, all this stuff. So, yeah, I don't think that it really is possible to have a totally open borders world. It doesn't make any sense.